At 9:47 a.m. on September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat inside the cockpit of a captured Japanese fighter at Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. He was preparing to test fly an aircraft that had already claimed the lives of hundreds of American pilots. The machine was a Mitsubishi A6M Model 21, serial number 4593, once belonging to Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. Koga was dead. His neck had snapped when this Zero flipped during a crash landing in an Aleutian marsh 2.5 months earlier. Yet the aircraft itself had survived almost completely intact. And now, Sanders was about to uncover something that would forever change the way American pilots fought in the Pacific. Sanders was a career naval aviator, a man who had spent 9 years flying for the Navy and had logged more test flight hours than nearly anyone else in service. He understood aircraft, how they moved, how they reacted, and how they could kill you with the smallest mistake. The Zero before him had been repainted in U.S. Navy colors, blue-gray over light gull-gray, with American stars on the wings and fuselage. But beneath the paint, it remained a Zero, the same fighter that had ruled Pacific skies since December 7th, 1941, the same plane that American pilots feared above all others. Sanders had pored over every intelligence report available about the Zero. He had read the accounts of survivors, analyzed reconnaissance photos, and memorized its performance data, a 12-to-1 kill ratio in China. On April 5th, 1942, Easter Sunday, 36 Zeros had engaged 60 British aircraft over Colombo, downing 27 of them, 15 Hurricanes, 8 Swordfish, and 4 Fulmars, while losing only one of their own. American P-39s had been cut down at altitude, F-2A Buffaloes slaughtered above the Philippines, F-4F Wildcats struggling against an opponent that could turn sharper, climb faster, and outmaneuver anything the U.S. could put in the air. The official American doctrine when facing a Zero was brutally simple. Avoid dogfights. Use dive-and-zoom tactics. Never engage in turning battles. If you tried to match their maneuverability, you would die. But avoiding combat came at a price. It meant leaving bombers unprotected, abandoning wingmen, and ceding the skies to an enemy that would then sink carriers, strafe runways, and obliterate squadrons on the ground. American airmen were dying because no one knew how to defeat the Zero. No one understood its flaws. No one had ever flown one. Until now. The Zero that Sanders was about to test had been recovered from Akutan Island in the Aleutians after Koga's crash on June 4, 1942. It took 3 recovery attempts to lift it from the swamp. The first crew, on July 11th, recovered Koga's body. The second, on July 12th, failed after their vessel lost 2 anchors. The third, on July 15th, finally succeeded using proper heavy machinery. The aircraft was shipped aboard the USS St. Miguel, arriving in Seattle on August 1st and later transported by barge to San Diego, arriving August 12th. Navy technicians spent weeks repairing its bent stabilizer, rudder, wingtips, canopy, landing gear, and propeller, straightening metal, fabricating missing pieces, and restoring the fighter to near original condition. Sanders would later say it was 98% authentic, 2% improvisation. When Sanders started the engine, the 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai 12 radial roared to life, its sound both familiar and foreign, reminiscent of American engines but carrying a unique pitch and rhythm. The propeller spun smoothly. Sanders checked his gauges. Oil pressure steady, temperature climbing as expected. Everything looked perfect. He taxied toward the runway. The Zero felt light and agile, even on the ground. Alive beneath his hands. The controls moved easily under his hands. He had been told the aircraft weighed about 555 libras fully loaded, according to museum specifications. That was 1,871 nanometer lighter than an F4F4 Wildcat at 7,426 lb. The weight difference was significant. Sanders advanced the throttle and began his takeoff roll. The Zero accelerated quickly. The tail came up. The aircraft lifted off after a remarkably short ground run. Sanders pulled the gear up and began to climb. The first thing he noticed was how light the controls felt, almost delicate. The stick moved with minimal force. The aircraft responded immediately to every input. At low speed, the Zero flew beautifully. It was stable, predictable, incredibly agile. Sanders made a few gentle turns. The aircraft rolled smoothly. He tried a steeper bank. The Zero snapped around with ease. He understood immediately why Japanese pilots loved this aircraft. At low speed, nothing in the American inventory could match it. Sanders climbed to 5,000 ft and began to explore the aircraft's handling characteristics. He tried stalls. The Zero gave plenty of warning before the brake, then recovered gently. He tried spins. The aircraft spun cleanly and recovered promptly. Everything about the Zero at low speed was forgiving, responsive, beautifully balanced. It was the kind of aircraft that made mediocre pilots feel, and skilled pilots feel, invincible. Then Sanders pushed the throttle forward and accelerated. At 190 knots, the Zero still felt good. The controls were light. The aircraft was responsive. Sanders was almost beginning to believe the reports from pilots who claimed the Zero could do anything. Then he crossed 200 knots, indicated airspeed, and everything changed. Sanders tried to roll the aircraft to the right. The stick moved. The ailerons deflected, but the aircraft's response was slow, sluggish. It felt like the air had suddenly become thick as molasses. Sanders had to use both hands on the stick to force the roll. The Zero responded, but not quickly, not immediately. There was a lag between input and action, a delay that did not exist at lower speeds. Sanders tried rolling to the left. The aircraft rolled more easily. Still not as crisp as at low speed, but better than rolling right. There was asymmetry in the controls. The Zero preferred to roll left. Rolling right required significantly more force and produced significantly less response. Sanders pushed the speed higher, 220 knots, 240 knots. The problem got worse. At 250 knots, rolling the Zero to the right was physically impossible. According to his later reports, the ailerons had frozen up. The control stick required enormous force to move, and the aircraft barely responded. Sanders felt like he was trying to roll a truck instead of a fighter. This was the weakness. This was what American pilots needed to know. The Zero could not roll quickly at high speed, especially to the right. It could not perform rapid reversals above 200 knots. Any American pilot who understood this could exploit it. Get the Zero into a high-speed engagement. Force it above 200 knots, then roll hard right before the Zero pilot could follow. The Zero could not match a hard right roll at speed. Its controls would lock up. The American could escape or reverse for a shot, while the Zero struggled to respond. Sanders continued the test flight. He tried other maneuvers. He pushed the Zero into a steep dive to test negative acceleration. The engine coughed and died. The carburetor was a float-type design that could not handle negative G-forces. Fuel flow was interrupted. The engine starved and quit until Sanders restored positive G-forces. That was the second weakness. The Zero could not follow an American aircraft through a pushover dive. Its engine would cut out. Any pilot being pursued by a Zero could shove the nose down, subject the Zero to negative acceleration, and watch its engine quit, while the American aircraft's pressure-fed carburetor continued to function normally. Sanders also noted the Zero's lack of armor protection. No steel plate behind the pilot, no bulletproof glass. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability. A few hits from .50 caliber machine guns would turn the Zero into a torch. The Japanese had sacrificed protection for performance. The aircraft was fast and agile because it was light and unarmored. but that meant Zero pilots died easily when hit. Sanders landed after 25 minutes. He climbed out of the cockpit and immediately wrote his preliminary report. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He had just flown the most dangerous enemy aircraft in the Pacific, and he had found its fatal flaws. His report stated clearly that the ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots, so that rolling maneuvers at those speeds were slow and required much force on the control stick. The aircraft rolled to the left much easier than to the right. Also, its engine cut out under negative acceleration due to its float-type carburetor. Sanders wrote down the answer for American pilots who were being outmaneuvered and unable to escape a pursuing Zero. Go into a vertical power dive using negative acceleration if possible to open the range while the Zero's engine is stopped by the acceleration. At about 200 knots, roll hard right before the Zero pilot can get his sights lined up. Those 3 sentences would save hundreds of American lives. Sanders flew 23 more test flights over the next 25 days from September 20th to October 15th, 1942. Each flight confirmed what he had discovered on that first sortie. The Zero was an exceptional low-speed dogfighter, but had serious limitations at high speed. American tactics needed toe change. Stop trying to turn with the Zero. Needed toe change. Stop trying to turn with the Zero. Use speed. Use high-speed maneuvers. Use hard right rolls above 200 knots. Use negative G pushovers to kill the Zero's engine. The tactical recommendations were radioed to Pacific Fleet units immediately after Sanders' first flight in late September 1942. Pilots in combat zones received the briefings within days. Some were skeptical. The Zero had dominated for so long that many pilots could not believe it had exploitable weaknesses. Others were desperate for any advantage and implemented the tactics immediately. Marine First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh was one of the first pilots to use Sanders' discoveries in combat. Walsh was flying an F-4U Corsair on August 15, 1943, during the Solomon Islands campaign when he engaged enemy aircraft over La Vela. He shot down 2 dive bombers and 1 fighter. Then, on August 30th over Kahili, he encountered approximately 50 Zeros. Walsh had attended the briefing about the captured Zero. He knew what to do. As a Zero got on his tail, Walsh put his Corsair into a split S maneuver. Nose down, inverted, pulling through. His Corsair accelerated rapidly in the dive. He needed at least 240 knots, preferably 260 knots. Then, as prescribed by Sanders's report, Walsh rolled hard right. As he rolled and continued the dive, traces from the Zero zinged past his belly. The Zero pilot was firing, but missing because his aircraft could not roll right fast enough to track Walsh through the maneuver. Walsh knew from the intelligence that came from the captured Zero that it rolled more slowly to the right than to the left. If he had not known which way to roll, he probably would have rolled left instinctively. If he had done that, the Zero would have turned with him, locked on, and killed him. Walsh shot down 4 Zeros that day before being forced to ditch. He received the Medal of Honor for these actions. He later stated that, knowing what to do with a Zero on his tail, information that came from the captured Zero saved his life several times. Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed kills, becoming the 4th-ranking Marine Corps ace. But Sanders was not the only pilot to test the captured Zero. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Trapnull was the chief of the test flight section at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Trapnull was considered one of the best and most experienced naval test pilots of his generation. He had evaluated nearly every aircraft type in the American inventory. In early 1943, the captured Zero was transferred to Anacostia, so Trapnull could conduct comparative testing. Trapnull flew the Zero in performance maneuvers, while other pilots simultaneously flew American fighters performing identical maneuvers. They simulated aerial combat. They tested how the Zero compared against the F-4F Wildcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and other American types. The goal was to document exactly what each American aircraft could and could not do against a Zero in specific tactical situations. Shrapnel confirmed everything Sanders had discovered. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat at most altitudes and had a faster climb rate, but it was more vulnerable to damage and less maneuverable at high speed. The Zero could outclimb American fighters below 15,000 ft, but American fighters with two-stage supercharges could outperform the Zero above 20,000 ft. The Zero had exceptional range, but terrible durability. American pilots needed to avoid low-speed turning dogfights, and instead use high-speed slashing attacks, diving passes, and energy tactics that exploited the Zero's high-speed control stiffening. Shrapnel's report included specific recommendations for different aircraft types. F-4F Wildcat pilots should never try to turn with a Zero below 250 knots. Instead, use diving attacks from altitude. Fire a quick burst, then extend away in a dive using the Wildcat's superior diving speed. The Zero could not follow through a high-speed dive without its controls locking up. F-4. You Corsair pilots should use their aircraft's superior speed and high-altitude performance. Stay fast, stay high, use boom and zoom tactics. Do not get slow. Do not get into a turning fight. P-38 pilots should use the same approach. Speed and altitude were the P-38's advantages. Use them. Never let a Zero force you into a slow-speed maneuvering fight. The tactical intelligence was disseminated throughout the Pacific Theater. By late 1942 and early 1943, fighter squadrons incorporated the findings into training. New pilots learned the Zero's weaknesses before they ever saw combat. The impact was immediate and measurable. Before the captured Zero was tested, American fighter-to-fighter kill ratios against Zeros were barely better than 1.1. F-4F Wildcats were losing pilots at nearly the same rate they were shooting down Zeros. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, after Sanders' tactical recommendations were distributed, Wildcat squadrons that implemented the new tactics saw their kill ratios climb to 5.9 to 1. That meant nearly 6 Z destroyed for every Wildcat lost in air-to-air combat. The improvement was not because American aircraft suddenly became better. The Wildcat in February 1943 was the same aircraft it had been in June 1942. The improvement was because American pilots knew how to fight the Zero. They understood its weaknesses. They knew to avoid turning dogfights. They knew to use speed and altitude. They knew to roll hard right above 200 knots. They knew to use negative G maneuvers to kill the Zero's engine. Japanese pilots began to notice the change in American tactics during late 1942. Flight reports from Imperial Japanese Navy units mentioned that American fighters were no longer trying to turn with Zeros. American pilots were using hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks, high-speed passes. Zeros that had previously been able to force Americans into turning fights were now unable to close with enemy aircraft that simply dived away at high speed. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's most experienced pilots. Official Japanese records documented 28 aerial victories for him, though some claimed more. He had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. In August 1942, Sakai was badly wounded during the Guadalcanal campaign when he mistook Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers for fighters and was hit by defensive fire from a rear gunner. He spent months recovering from severe head wounds that left him partially blind. When he returned to combat in 1943, he immediately noticed that American tactics had changed. Sakai later wrote that American pilots were no longer making the mistakes they'd made in early 1942. They were no longer trying to dogfight with Zeros. They were using their aircraft's strengths and exploiting the Zero's weaknesses. Sakai found it increasingly difficult to shoot down American fighters using the tactics that had worked so well in the war's first year. He would eventually be promoted to NN in August 1944 and sub-lieutenant in 1945. but never achieved the rank of lieutenant commander that some sources incorrectly attribute to him. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar observations. The Americans had learned something. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed American aircraft, but found no significant modifications. American fighters looked the same as they always had. The engines were the same. The armament was the same. Nothing visible had changed. What the Japanese did not know was that the change was not in the aircraft. The change was in the tactics. The change was knowledge. Knowledge that came from Sanders' test flights in the captured Zero. Knowledge that was impossible for the Japanese to counter because it was invisible. You cannot develop tactics against an enemy who knows your aircraft's performance envelope better than you do. By early 1943, American test pilots had flown the Zero more extensively than most Japanese pilots ever would. Sanders and Trapnell had documented every quirk, every limitation, every weakness. That information was in the hands of American combat pilots. Japanese pilots were still flying the Zero the same way they had always flown it. But the Americans now knew exactly how to counter every move. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. For the first year of the war, Zero pilots had dominated Pacific skies. They knew they could outmaneuver any American fighter in a turning dogfight. That confidence was absolute. But by mid-1943, that confidence was eroding. Zeros were being shot down at increasing rates. Experienced pilots were being killed. New replacement pilots were even less prepared to face American fighters that now used tactics specifically designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an air staff officer aboard carrier Ryujo, the same carrier from which Koga had launched, had direct knowledge of the Zero's capabilities and the impact of its capture. He would later co-author a book with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi in 1956, stating that the capture of Koga's Zero was no less serious than the defeat at Midway and did much to hasten Japan's final defeat. This assessment came from someone who understood both the tactical and strategic implications of the Americans gaining complete knowledge of the Zero's performance characteristics. The captured Zero remained in American hands until February 1945. It was used for training, for tactical development, for engineering study. Hundreds of American pilots flew mock combat against it. Hundreds more attended briefings where they learned its characteristics. The aircraft was eventually destroyed in a ground accident when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control while taxiing and struck the Zero. Commander Richard Cromlam was at the controls when the Helldivers' propeller sliced the Zero into pieces. By that time, the Zero was no longer the most dangerous aircraft in the Pacific. American fighters had caught up and surpassed it. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had entered service in August 1943. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, far more durable, and could match the Zero's maneuverability at combat speeds while maintaining better high-speed handling. Hellcat pilots used the same tactics that Sanders had developed: boom and zoom, high-speed passes, no turning dogfights. The Hellcat's kill ratio against all Japanese aircraft types was 19-1. The VA F-4U Corsair also benefited from Sanders' work. Corsair pilots knew from their training exactly how the Zero would behave at different speeds and altitudes. They knew when the Zero's controls would stiffen. They knew when to roll right. They knew when to use -G. The Corsair's kill ratio was 11.1. Even the older F-4F Wildcat continued to improve its performance. By the end of the war, the official Wildcat kill ratio had climbed to 6.9-1, according to Naval History and Heritage Command records. 1327 enemy aircraft destroyed versus 178 aerial losses. The improvement was not because the Wildcat became a better aircraft. The improvement was because Wildcat pilots knew how to fight. The impact of Sanders' test flights extended beyond simple kill ratios. Military historians note that the tactical intelligence derived from the captured Zero fundamentally changed the Pacific Air War, though they debate the exact number of lives saved. Marine ace William Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure and stated that no other captured machine had ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. Multiple aces credited tactics from the Akutan Zero testing with saving their lives on multiple occasions. However, some historians challenge the contention that it took dissection of Koga's Zero to create tactics that beat the airplane. The Thatchy had been developed before Pearl Harbor based on intelligence from China. 9 Zeros were recovered from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and studied. Trapnell himself stated on October 6, 1942, that the general impression of the airplane is exactly as originally created by intelligence, including the performance, suggesting much was already known. Yet, the value of having a flyable Zero cannot be understated. It provided confirmation of intelligence, precise performance numbers, and, most importantly, hands-on experience that could be transmitted to combat pilots. The testing provided exact speeds where control stiffening occurred, precise roll rates at different airspeeds, and specific tactical recommendations that pilots could implement immediately. Sanders never received public recognition for his test flights during the war. His name did not appear in press releases. His contribution was classified. The test reports were secret. The tactical recommendations were distributed only to combat units. Sanders continued his career as a naval aviator. He flew combat missions later in the war. He tested other captured enemy aircraft. He trained new pilots. He survived the war and eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring. When asked about the Zero test flights, he said he was just doing his job. Testing aircraft was what test pilots did. The fact that the aircraft happened to be an enemy fighter that would provide critical tactical intelligence was simply circumstance. Trapnell also never received widespread public recognition for his role in testing the Zero during the war. He went on to become one of the most influential figures in naval aviation history. He co-founded the United States Naval Test Pilot School along with Commander Sidney Sherby and with backing from Rear Admiral Apollo Susk. The formal school was approved January 22, 1948, with the first class beginning. July 6, 1948, Trapnell was promoted to commander, then captain by May 1943. He was the first Navy pilot to fly a jet aircraft. He shaped the development of carrier aviation for decades, but his work with the captured Zero remained just one of hundreds of test programs he conducted during his career. Tadayoshi Koga, the Japanese pilot whose Zero was captured, died instantly when his aircraft flipped in the Aleutian Marsh. He was 19 years old, born September 10, 1922. His wingmen had circled overhead, unsure if he was alive or dead. They had orders to destroy any Zero that crashed in enemy territory, but they could not bring themselves to strafe the aircraft while Koger might still be alive inside. They left. They reported the crash. They did not know that decision would give the Americans the intelligence advantage that helped turn the tide of the Pacific Air War. Cog was initially buried in a shallow grave on July 11, 1942, then re-earied with a Christian ceremony on July 12th. He was exhumed in 1947 by the American Graves Registration Service and reinterred on Adak Island with a marker reading Unknown Japanese Flyer. His remains were likely among 223 unidentified Japanese remains that were cremated in 1953 and interred at Chidori Gafuchi National Cemetery in Dainonfi, Tokyo. His family never knew during the war that his aircraft had been captured and flown by American pilots. The Japanese military never officially acknowledged the loss of the Zero until after the war. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be called, represented one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. It was not a secret weapon. It was not a code machine. It was not a strategic plan. It was an aircraft. But flying that aircraft and documenting its weaknesses Sanders gave American pilots the knowledge they needed to survive and win. That knowledge spread from pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, across the entire Pacific theater. It changed tactics. It changed training. It changed outcomes. The story demonstrates that knowledge is just as important as technology in warfare. The Zero did not change between June 1942 and February 1943. It was the same aircraft with the same capabilities and the same limitations. But American pilots' understanding of how to fight it changed completely. And that change in understanding produced a measurable improvement in combat effectiveness. In any conflict, understanding your opponent's capabilities and limitations is as valuable as superior technology. You can have the best aircraft in the world, but if you use it incorrectly against an opponent who knows its weaknesses, you will lose. On the other hand, it's possible to win even with an inferior aircraft, if you fully understand how to exploit your opponent's weaknesses while avoiding combat in situations that favor their strengths. Sanders's test flights in September 1942 gave American pilots that crucial insight. They discovered that the Zero's remarkable agility at low speeds came at the expense of control stiffness at higher velocities. They learned that its impressive range was achieved by sacrificing durability and protection, and that its light construction made it fragile under stress and dangerous for its pilot in combat. Every strength carried a matching weakness. Every engineering decision required a trade-off. Sanders recorded these compromises in exhaustive detail, and American combat pilots used that knowledge to survive and prevail in the skies. Today, fragments of the Akutan Zero still exist in museums. A small section is preserved at the Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum in Anchorage, while several more are displayed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. The majority of the aircraft was destroyed in February 1945 when a Helldiver's propeller tore it apart. Yet, the legacy of that plane endures, etched into the history of naval aviation and the air combat tactics still taught to fighter pilots today. Fight intelligently. Know your adversary. Exploit their flaws. Avoid their strengths. Use your advantages. Sanders understood this better than anyone. He flew the Zero 24 times, carefully documenting every flight. He wrote the reports that saved lives and then returned to his duties, testing the next aircraft on the roster. That is how real innovation unfolds in wartime, not through grand strategy or political decree, but through test pilots who risk everything to study enemy machines, analyze their behavior, and share that knowledge with those who need it most. Sanders didn't redesign American fighters. He transformed how American pilots fought, and that made all the difference.